the difference between wisdom and knowledge?
What did they say already?
Oh, I see Nelson's hand up.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is a professional question for me since I'm a philosopher. But I think Sheila hit the mark perfectly. Knowledge is the truth, knowing what it is, knowing how it is. But wisdom is knowing when and where to use it, when and where to apply it.
Great. So it seems like we have some consensus here.
Yeah,
Nina.
The philosophy professor.
Right.
knowledge is what you learn. Wisdom is how you use it.
Knowledge, what you learn, wisdom, how you use it. Does anybody disagree or have a different opinion about it?
Oh, and also wisdom is what you supposedly are supposed to gain as you get older.
Okay, so that's wisdom, something you gain older. So that adds to another layer, right? That there's something about lived experience that amounts to wisdom.
About turning
Well, that means you can learn some
It's an
wisdom.
age of wisdom.
Yeah.
Nelson, what?
It also means then you can learn wisdom.
Yeah.
That you can't, okay, because maybe at a certain age, before then, maybe you're.
No, but experience teaches you. You reflect upon what's happened and you say, now I understand.
Right. So maybe it's a matter of looking back, having enough road miles.
What do you say? Street knowledge?
Okay, so street smarts versus book smarts. Maybe knowledge might be more book smarts, but wisdom might be more street smarts. Wisdom comes with the wrinkles. Love that.
Oh, I like that.
The white hair.
In the white hair. Okay, lovely. So I just got back from Florida. As I spoke about it, you guys, thank you. You guys have been so supportive and so loving. And I'll say that there were members of B'nai Yeshurun who came to both the funeral and to Shiva. Florida, yes, but really, it's such a special family here, and we really feel that. So I just want to take a second to thank you all for being. They were already there, yes, yeah. Oh, yeah, they didn't fly down for it, thank God. But my grandpa, who like Nelson, I mean, he was a doctor. He was not a professor of philosophy, but he studied philosophy in undergrad and he was really interested in it. And he would always tell us that knowledge is what you know. Wisdom is knowing how much you don't know.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the jumping off point for today's discussion.
in Chabad? Third one.
Chokmah, Bina, and Da'at.
Okay, so there's wisdom, knowledge, and what's the third one?
Good. No, that is a great question. So Chabad is an acronym, right, for Chokmah, Bina, and Da'at. These are Kabbalistic attributes of God as well, but they're also three different types of knowledge. And I actually can't differentiate the three offhand. I have to go and research that. But right, so there are different kinds, but that's the point, right? That there in our tradition, different kinds of knowing and taking in the world and experiencing. Maybe Rabbi House, and we have another rabbi there who can help with that. But question basically, what is and not putting on the spot here, but the difference between Chokmah, Bina, and Da'at?
Excellent question.
Right.
Well,
Chokmah.
if you look, so yeah, if you look closely at that, we actually have so they're either synonyms, or they're just so the word.
But I think if the English translation of that prayer, if I'm remembering correctly, would be wisdom, knowledge, and discernment. So what's the difference between wisdom versus knowledge, and then add in discernment in there? Yeah, Elliot.
Knowing what one does not know to another level, henceforth humility.
Yes.
Irrespective of how much experience one has in the field, how many degrees they have, recognition. I don't know that, turning it over into behavioral manifestations that show genuine humility.
Yes. So that also could take us in the direction of a conversation on leadership, right? And it's not just enough to know a lot, right? We want our leaders to know a lot, but in our tradition, right, our leaders, Moses being the prime example, are typically those who have the most humility, who say no, not me. Who am I that I should be, right, a leader of the people, right? That God seems to value humility, not just what you know or capable of knowing, but that sense of I'm not finished. Yeah.
But then with Moses, you get into the issue of what is the source of his knowledge?
Mhm.
And I'd have to assume God,
Mm.
because I think that's the one that we assume he has got received his knowledge from.
Right.
The rest of us don't do it that way.
Right. It's more through our experiential or through our reading, but maybe this is sort of a more with Moses, it was a receiving a divine intelligence. Right. Maimonides puts out layers of intelligence, levels of intelligence, and then Moses was on this 10th level of intelligence that it wasn't just that God chose somebody because of their good qualities, but that Moses had actually had a level of intellectual preparation that like a radio tuning into the right frequency, that he sort of tuned into this frequency to receive God's signal. And what I love about that understanding is that God is communicating to all of us simultaneously at the same time. It's about whether we're able to tune into that frequency the way that Moses did. A different way to look at it. So today I've brought us a few sources. Before diving into the Midrash, I brought something from Mishlei, which is Proverbs. So we have Proverbs, we have Midrash, and we have Pirkei Avot, the wisdom, the ethics of our ancestors. So we have three sources within our Torah that really deal with wisdom, particularly Proverbs, which is a collection of often adages and sort of our wisdom in our tradition, and Pirkei Avot, which is in Mishnah, in our oral law, a collection of the wisdom of our ancestors as well. So we're going to dive into our tradition, wisdom from our tradition, and see what does it tell us about the true nature of wisdom, what it means to be wise as opposed to just having knowledge. Nelson.
Well, one of the problems in a discussion like this is that in English, know has two different meanings. There's factual knowledge, but there's also knowing how. Other languages, I don't know about Hebrew, just separate those two. They're not the same word. It's very important. One of the aspects of wisdom is knowing what you don't know, discernment, as Eliot would put it. But also that means that relying upon the people who do know. Don't because you're smart and you know a lot, don't suppose you know everything and therefore that you know how to do this next thing when in fact you know nothing about it.
Right. No, right. This presumption, right? Presumption. Wait, I'm a smart person. I can figure this out. And then you try to fix the sink and then your kitchen's flooding. Just because you know one thing, it doesn't mean you know how to do everything. There are different skill sets, and knowing what's with not your skill set yet is a valuable trait. Yeah.
Hebrew yada has two meanings.
Are you talking about the biblical sense of knowing? Yeah. Yes, exactly. So there's that too, right? Yes.
I know out of what she speaks.
I stepped away to get more soup, so I might have missed it. Know your enemy.
Good. Right. So another sense of knowing your enemy. And by that you mean like know in terms of like knowing who's on your side and who's not. So maybe a level of understanding people, right? There are characters who are very brainy and intellectual, but may lack the people skills. So that's sort of another degree of knowing is sort of interpersonal, right? And EQ, right? There's IQ and then there's EQ, emotional intelligence, right? Hey, Jackie, good to see you. There's room here too if you want to do. Okay, so let's dive in. This is from Mishlei, from Proverbs. And this is wisdom personified. So wisdom is speaking as if wisdom is actually a character. So who'd like to read? Go for it, Larry, thanks.
God created me at the beginning of God's course. As the first of God's works of old, the distant past, I was fashioned. At the beginning, the origin of earth. There was still no deep when I was brought forth, no springs rich in water before the foundations of the mountains were sunk. For the hills I was born. God had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first clumps of clay. I was there when God set the heavens into place, fixed the horizon upon the deep. When God made the heavens above firm, and the fountains of the deep gushed. When God assigned the sea its limits, waters did not transgress God's command. And when God fixed the foundations of the earth, I was with God as a confidant, a source of delight every day, rejoicing before God at all times, rejoicing in God's inhabited world, finding delight with humanity.
So it's interesting, first of all, to personify wisdom at all, right? And I think it maybe strikes us as maybe even Greek, like the muse, right? You're sort of you appeal to the muse before you write your play or sing your song. You're sort of looking for inspiration. This obviously predates that, but the idea that wisdom was created first, that God, before creating the world, created wisdom. What do we make of that? What is that adding to our understanding of how God created the world?
Now we know it was before the Big Bang.
Go ahead, say more. What?
Wisdom came before the Big Bang.
Wisdom came before the Big, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So say, yeah.
I get a very negative feeling from reading that.
Okay, how come?
In other words, wisdom is, it's a certain snobbishness. Like I went to the best college. I knew God personally, therefore I really have wisdom.
Interesting. So this is tying back to our humility conversation, right? Where like maybe wisdom is depicted as not having much humility, which seems counter to how you would expect wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it would strike me.
Yes. Although I think I would ask why in the right. Wisdom seems self-centered. Why? And I would ask why wisdom feels the need in the book of Proverbs to pump wisdom up that way. To say I was there. Why does wisdom feel the need to? That's interesting. Yeah.
So on the other hand, we should be humble because wisdom is more important than all the physical things in the universe.
Right. Okay. So if wisdom came before physical things, right? If God created wisdom before creating the physical world, then maybe that's saying that there is more importance to wisdom than to physical material things. Maybe there's a lesson there that God's priority before creating the physical world was to create something ethereal, spiritual, or wisdom, which is most important. And God's list of priorities, wisdom comes first to teach us. That's great. Jerry and then Ron.
But where did the tree of knowledge?
Sorry?
Where did the tree of knowledge fit into this area? Plus, he rewrites the Torah because it says man was there before things that, in fact, weren't true. Other things were there that he talks about the glory of heaven. They were there before man was created.
Right, exactly. Right, so I thought about bringing more sources about what exactly was created before the world, because there's a whole list that the rabbis give. And actually, it's in Pirkei Avot, just after our final one. But I decided to focus in on wisdom in particular. But some of the things that the rabbis say were created beforehand are things that defy the natural law, right? So for instance, the manna from heaven, the well of water that appeared for the Israelites in the wilderness, things that defy natural order. The rabbis say God must have created that before the world or during the 6 days of creation, so that it's not that they're supernatural things. They were part of God's plan from the beginning. But so I thought about taking us in that direction of let's explore all the things that were created before the world. So we could do that in another session, but I decided to focus on wisdom for this one. But it's a good point, right? That our tradition says that God created things before the world. And there's also, our tradition says that God created many worlds before this one. That God sort of had other worlds before, and deciding that this was the product God wanted to move forward.
Just a quick question.
Oh, and then Ron, I'm sorry.
Since it says God created me at the beginning of his creation, does that mean that when he made man, we came with wisdom? I mean, the wisdom was already there.
Right, and so that goes back to what Jerry's saying about the tree of knowledge and how does this factor into everything. So the reason I brought that up is Gan Eden is one of the things that says that God created before or during those 6, but before the creation of the world. That God had the idea of Gan Eden before, and so implemented that. So presumably then the tree of knowledge, was that created before the world as well? And so what came first, wisdom or knowledge?
The man had tasted from the tree of knowledge.
Right. So Yeah, no, but it's a good question of how does the tree of knowledge factor into all of this? And did wisdom exist before knowledge? Like could the first human beings have been wise had they never eaten from the tree, or did they need to eat from the tree in order to acquire wisdom? Or was the act of eating from the tree unwise? So it must exist because they did the opposite, so it had to have existed. Interesting. Ron and then Sheila and Jack.
Yeah,
And then I'll get Nelson. Yeah.
I had two totally different points. One was that I think I'll go to the second one first. The second one where those things were created during creation, I think 10 of them or something.
Yes.
Moses' staff and
Yes.
That leads me to say that if those were created before at the beginning like that, then where was free will?
Where was what?
Where is free will?
How did free will come into it? Because he already knew that these things were going to happen and those were going to be needed.
Right. Right. So, yeah, I want to explain that for everybody. But so another one of those things that God created before, according to what the in Pirkei Avot, the rabbis say that 10 things God created before God created the world. Those supernatural, the things that would otherwise defy the law of nature. Moses' staff, right, which performs those miracles, like
Bilam's donkey.
Right, Bilam's donkey, the mouth speaking, because at one point Bilam's donkey speaks to him in his language like a human. So these are things that God ordained from the start. And so Ron is saying, well, where is free will in all this if God knew that all of these things would happen, if they would be necessary? And I would say that opens up another, obviously, separate conversation about.
I'm always getting back to
right. It's deeper. It's a deeper. But I would say there are rabbis and commentators and scholars in our tradition who, like, I'm thinking of Rabbi Levi, who actually, did you know that on the moon there is a crater named after Rabbi Levi?
Didn't know that.
Isn't that bizarre? So that they're actually, I think of there's the United States flag that was planted on the moon, but there is also sort of our Torah planted on the moon a little bit because there's a crater named after who was an astronomer. Rabbi Levi.
Rabbi Levi was an astronomer.
He was a
every rabbi had a day job.
He never obviously got to the moon, but it's interesting. If you look up Wikipedia, Rabbi Levi crater on the moon. But why did I bring that up? I lost my I'm trying to remember why, but well, the idea, so free will, how he reconciled it. He says that God doesn't know what people are going to do, but knows all the potential outcomes. And so that God may have certain things that are like.
There could be another dozen things out there that we haven't seen yet because the occurrence hasn't happened yet.
Right. So I think these things were preordained, not because God necessarily knew exactly how history would play out, because people have free will to change the course of history, but God has an idea of the arc that we will most likely follow or all the possible outcomes. And so those things existed as what most likely would need to come into play, and then they did. I think that's one way you can reconcile how did God preordain things, but we still have free will.
The second point, which was really my first point, was that I think this is saying that Torah existed before creation.
This.
That's what this is saying.
It is. And we're going to get to how the rabbis are doing that. But there's one big clue, a word in Mishlei that the rabbis are going to pick up on midrashically. Can anybody guess? And I'll tell you that it's in the first sentence. If you look at the Hebrew, even if you're not as comfortable in Hebrew, it may be easier to see the word. How do we derive that wisdom was there since before God created the world?
God's works.
Go ahead. Right. Right. And that's what they're saying. That's the claim they're making. But there is a particular word that they're pulling from the verse in Mishlei, from Proverbs. Right, Kedem before. So but actually Reshit, right? What is Reshit? Bereshit.
Reshit comes before Bereshit.
Right. Bereshit, the first word in our Torah in the beginning is Bereshit, in the beginning, right? So because wisdom in Proverbs is saying, Adonai Kanani Reshit, God acquired me or created me Reshit first, the rabbis are making the claim, therefore, because the word Reshit is used here, that they're saying that that's referring to Bereshit, and that God actually created the world with the help of wisdom that God created beforehand.
There's also a problem in Greek philosophy, which they must have known about, that what does when mean if there's no time yet? What you ask the question, what happened before God created, as if there was you could do that. And it's the logic of that question which puzzles the Greeks, puzzles the early Christians, and it must have puzzled the rabbis as well.
Absolutely right. What is time even? If we mark time as human beings by the sun or the moon, or right, what is time before those things were created? Sheila, then Jackie, then Elliot.
Yeah, this is, I forgot the word. But that is in line with, they're sort of hinting that, hey, we weren't the first ones. God created, there were other civilizations, or I mean.
Nice. So there's a realization that we're not the center of the universe, right? That God had created other things before us. And then maybe that's at the heart of wisdom, right? Humility again. That's good. Jackie, then Elliot.
Well, I'm thinking about when Solomon was asked what he wanted. He didn't ask for wisdom. He asked for an understanding heart.
Yes. Good. So that again gets like, what's the difference between, that might have been Binah, or both might have to go back and check, but right, the different iterations or forms of wisdom and knowledge, right? Understanding, how that's different. And for a king, you have understanding, an understanding heart, right? Again, that goes back to our conversation on leadership. What is the most important quality of a leader, right? We can make the case that maybe it's an understanding heart. Okay, Elliot.
Since we're focused on time, at which point was our neshama created? Was that at birth or before birth? Did God plan out what each of us would be like? Simple questions.
Yes, very simple questions. Right.
Is that wisdom?
I'm trying to look for a label.
No, but that's interesting. So going back to Rabbi Levi, this comment, he would have said that the neshama, that there are two sort of like souls. One is your material soul that dies when you do, but then there's your soul that acquires wisdom, and that outlives you. So I actually think there is a tie between wisdom and the soul, at least even in our medieval commentators' understanding. Chad.
So how do we know this passage is about wisdom?
If you look in the context, I ripped it up, but from the original context. But if you read a few verses before the start of this, Mishle, it says.
And is it clear that the Hebrew word, it is about wisdom as opposed to like truth or goodness?
Good question.
You learned so much from us.
I think chokhmah is used. So I do think it's referring to wisdom, but I don't think it's a stretch to say we're talking about truth here or that they're one and the same. And again, now we're like, it's a semantic conversation, and what language are we semantically parsing? But I think you can make a link between truth and chokhmah here that is okay. I don't think the word emet is used. I do think it's chokhmah, which is wisdom, but I think the meaning is similar. But why do you ask? I'm sure there's something behind that.
Well, I started, when you first posed the question, I wondered, is there a temporal or sequential relationship between knowledge and wisdom? Knowledge is the acquisition of everything that has happened and is happening, and wisdom is the application of the knowledge to inform what comes next or the future. But here we've got wisdom coming before everything else, which is interesting to me because to me the wisdom has to deal with the application of knowledge, right?
Oh, that's interesting. So there's an interesting inversion here. And I think that idea of application is really interesting because in our next source, which we're going to dive into in just a moment, we'll see that the rabbis they say, why did God create wisdom first? What role did wisdom play in the creation of the world? And they say that wisdom, I'm now spoiling the next source of it, but wisdom was basically God's blueprint. And what is a blueprint but how to apply, right, your vision? So I do think you can you can see how maybe God needed wisdom first, even though usually it's applied and that comes later, but it's the blueprint for how to apply. Maybe. Jerry, and then we're going to dive into the next.
Well, my source of wisdom is often science fiction. The concept of alternative universe, in which everybody's the same, each universe, but what they're like has to do with the things that were done by these people, what decisions they made at different times.
Yes.
In a way, you can say that about consequences. In other words, if you do this, you do that. But the outcome can be different depending on the universe you live in.
Right.
And so when you wish to be in a universe where Trump is not president, you be careful, because in that universe, something worse might have happened.
Right. There's an episode of The Simpsons, another source of great knowledge, which is where
You probably wrote the episode, right?
no, I never wrote on The Simpsons. Boy, that would be something. But Homer goes back in time and literally to the prehistoric era. He's with the dinosaurs. And he realized I can't touch anything because if I touch, even if I step on a fly or like it could change the course of history. And it's what happens. He steps on one thing and trips on another and like mess, and then he goes forward and it's a whole different, right? Even the butterfly effect of one small change can alter a whole universe. I want us, for the sake of time, let's dive into now our Midrash, right? This is Genesis Rabbah, and take a look, everyone. This is Midrash Rabbah, which we've learned before, but this is 1-1. So we're at the very beginning. We're at Reshit. We're at the beginning of Reshit Rabbah. So who wants to read for us? Go for it. Thank you.
Rabbi Hoshea the Great began. I was with God as an Ammon, a delight day after day.
So this is wisdom, right? We're going from Proverbs. Now they're commenting on what we just read.
Ammon means a child's caretaker. Ammon means covered. Ammon means hidden. And some say Ammon means greatness.
Good. I'm going to pause just for 1 second. So just like in typical rabbinic fashion, especially for Midrash, they are debating what the word Ammon means here, right? It says that wisdom was an Ammon with God. And so they say, well, Ammon can mean different things. And they say it could mean a child's caretaker, right? At one point, Moses says, when Moses is so frustrated with the people, he says, "What am I? Ammon eunuch? I think, like, am I a wet nurse for this people? Am I their mother? Am I somebody who's supposed to?" Right. So that's one use. Ammon means covered. Ammon means hidden. Ammon means greatness. Some say, and then it goes on to give you the proof texts for when it means those things in different verses. But I cut that out, and then we come back later. Go ahead. Another matter.
Another matter. Ammon means artisan. Uman. The Torah is saying, I was the tool of craft of the Holy Blessed One. The way of the world is that when a king of flesh and blood builds a palace, he does not build it based on his own knowledge, but rather based on the knowledge of an artisan. And the artisan does not build it based on his own knowledge, but rather he has plans, sheets, and tablets by which to ascertain how he should build its rooms, how he should build its doors. So too, the Holy Blessed One looked in the Torah and created the world. The Torah says Bereshit, God created, and Reshit is nothing other than the Torah, as it says, the Lord made me at the beginning of his way.
So the rabbis now make a move connecting wisdom with Torah. What is wisdom? Of course, wisdom is Torah. So therefore, before God created the world, God created what? Torah, and Torah was God's blueprint for creating the world.
Or maybe Torah was
Sheila.
there before.
Amen. But all of them done, you could say is Amen.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you're at, and this is what I love when you guys create your own midrash. Ron has come to me a number of times saying, I have this midrash that I'm working on, and
I never finish them.
Yeah. Okay, but so good, right? What do the rabbis miss out here? They talk about all these different uses of oman or uman, but what about amen, which is I agree, or emunah, faith or truth?
Go back to Amen.
Yeah.
This is
Some of the.
Yeah, right. So that's I like that. But so here they're going on, they land on finally uman, that it means artisan. And that God, just like a king or a ruler would, in building a castle, building a palace, you consult the architect, but the architect doesn't just do it willy-nilly, right? Doesn't just to improvise, right? They have a plan. And so God had the plan, which was Torah. And God looked into the Torah to create the the world. What does that add to our understanding of how God created the world? What does that add if we imagine that God created Torah first and then looked at the Torah to create the world?
And Torah is our rabbinic manual, our life manual.
A blueprint. So maybe Torah is a blueprint that everything is in it.
Right, it's source for it.
Yeah, I will say that there's something, you know, when we get the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and we get pages and pages of paragraph this 10 cubits by 10 cubits, and this was this material, and you ask yourself why, like all of Torah is holy and sacred, and but why do we need to,
or the description of the ark,
or the description of the ark, or at length, right? Why do we need to? What is this? Right. So in case you're okay, so maybe for practical purposes, if we want to rebuild, we know how. Certainly the rabbis, that was very important to them. But I think partially also it's like maybe it establishes God as architect of the universe. Like look at God's attention to detail. And then you think of the human body, right? And all the doctors in the room, right? The more you know about the body, the more you're just in awe of all. If one, that's the Asher Yatzar prayer that we say, right? If one little small thing was off, I would cease to exist. So maybe the reason we have all these details that we might wonder why we read so many times, they're actually something really beautiful in thinking, wow, how thoughtfully and carefully everything was created.
This is ridiculous, but we need all the details about the art, because when the archaeologists find it eventually, they have to know what it is.
Maybe that's why, yeah.
This was the one sentence that was created first. To me, it wasn't a wrong is that
I didn't have a problem.
Well, with this, not necessarily the free will, but that the history is all laid out already. So, but by creating the Torah, to me that means everything from the beginning until Moses' death, the actual Chumash, and so
right,
all that's already laid out. So again, free will, you can do things like that. But if all that's already before, then that has to happen some way. So God is in effect some way pulling the strings.
So that is so interesting, right? And if the Torah pre-existed creation and the Torah contains, our tradition's historical events, what happens and who does what, how could you possibly have free will if the Torah was created before creation? I think it's a great question.
I think I answer for that one.
Okay, then you go and then I go. Yeah,
I have the belief that time is a human construct. God doesn't have time, therefore he already knows what's going to happen because he's been there and seen it already.
Right. So God doesn't live in one moment and there is a future that God isn't aware of. God is sort of all over the
all knowing, so he already knows.
Right. And God doesn't live maybe in the present moment the way we do. We live in a present moment. Maybe God is able to write something not to predetermine what's going to happen, but because
he already knows
God has been there and knows that what will happen. Right. But there still is the idea that if God knows exactly what's going to happen, then we don't have free will. If God knows that I'm going to order chocolate ice cream, then free will is an illusion, and I might think I'm following through. So it's a heavy question, and I thought Nelson would have his hand up. I actually anticipated that you would have your hand up. So go. Yeah, Nelson.
You knew I was going to help hold up my hand.
Yeah, it's exactly.
So I was thinking that in the days when our ancestors were tailors and seamstresses and carpenters and worked with their hands, this was all really fascinating to them. Today we're lawyers and doctors, and this looks like, why bother with all this stuff? But you have to know your audience, and that was part of God's wisdom.
Wait, say more. I want to know what makes you say that.
Well, because he knew what kind of people would be reading the Torah.
Oh,
what would
interesting.
they be interested in?
Yeah, right. It says that the Torah was written in the language of humanity, right? So when there are things like, why does God redeem us with a strong hand and outstretched arm, right? A mighty arm, and that God doesn't have a body. Why is it saying that God? But the point is, it's so that we would understand. It's a metaphor that speaks in a language we can understand, right? So you're saying the Torah was written with an audience in mind, or at least using the language that could be understood by its reader. But I just want to say one more point about this, which is I might address the free will issue as maybe the Torah that was created before the world. Maybe it's the Torah we have today when we think of Torah, but maybe it was some kind of celestial Torah that's a little bit different than the Torah we have today. And what I mean by that is when God gives Torah the first time, right? God gives, it's both written and inscribed by God. The stones are carved by God and it's written by God and given to Moses. What happens to that set?
I got an answer. Forget about what happened to the first set. I got an understand. Here's another one of my Midrash. That because God gave us a Torah in a cloud with thunder, we didn't see it properly, we didn't hear it properly.
Okay, interesting.
And so what he said isn't what we heard.
Interesting. Right. So that
died too.
That kind of, sorry?
We died.
We died, right, and came back alive. There's a Midrash that with the first letter of the first commandment, Anochi, that aleph, which obviously doesn't make a sound, but even with that, the people could not withstand that amount of holy energy, and it was overwhelming that we died and came back alive and came back and died again and came back alive. There's another that we were propelled back miles and miles and had to keep angels walked us back to Mount Sinai each time. That it was just so overpowering. There's different ways that the rabbis imagine receiving Torah. But I just want to finish that thought, which is that first set of Torah is smashed, right? Moses sees that we were worshiping the golden calf, and Moses hurls the tablets to the ground and shatters them. And then Moses goes back up the second time for the second set. And it says that the second was the same as the first, but we know that this time Moses carves it and God writes on it. So it's a little bit different in the sense that the second one is more, there's a partnership, a human hand in that Torah. And why I'm saying this is that the rabbis say that maybe the two Torahs were a little different because the first one was so perfect, it was completely the work of God, that it wasn't fit for this world. We were not ready for that Torah. So the second Torah, which has a human hand in it, that's a Torah that we could actually live by. So maybe they're a little bit different. So I'm only bringing this to say that maybe the Torah that was created before the creation of the world is a celestial Torah, a little bit different than the one that we have today. And maybe, and why that's so important to me is that whenever I have like a trouble with something in the Torah, I say that seems to me as morally problematic. I don't really understand what's going on here. One of my rabbis, Rabbi Artson from rabbinical school, he said, maybe what's happening is this is a product of that second Torah with the human hand in it, but everything is holy, every word, every law, but we have to peer through it to the original celestial Torah, that there is something. So maybe there is a difference of some kind. Yes, last comment, and then I want to say one more point about this, and we'll move to our final texts. Go ahead.
Wisdom came first. We believe God is all good and created the blueprint for the world. My question is, where does all this evil come from? Starting with the evil of the snake in the Garden of Eden saying, defy God. And going to the free will of man where there's consummate evil. What's the derivation of that evil?
It's a great question. And again, this is the stuff of philosophy courses and whole, semesters of discussion. But I like the idea that evil is a derivation of God's will. That God says, don't eat the apple, we eat the apple, we have knowledge of good and evil. That God ultimately, at least in my conception of God, although then there's the problem of evil, which is, well, then if God is all good, where does evil come from? Did God not create evil? And there's a blessing originally when we say, Yotzer or u'varei choshech, oseh shalom u'varei et hakol, that God created everything, right? Light and darkness, day and night, and created everything. That's a later version of the prayer. The first version of the prayer, Yotzer u'varei choshech, oseh shalom u'varei et hara, that God created badness, that God also created evil, right? So there is that, but then what, right? So is evil part of God? Because if God is the source of everything, then must evil naturally be a part of, or is evil this sort of human-made creation that is a derivation of God's will? It's a great question.
The snake is not human.
Right, and the snake is not human. So maybe not, right, don't blame it just on humans, right? Originally it came from the animal world. Yeah, no, but it's good. So good question. But I just want to say that, yeah, we are part of the animal world.
You need the contrast, though.
Uh-huh.
There is no good.
Right,
There's
can
no
good exist,
bad.
evil, right?
Evil.
Yeah, I love how you can't open one philosophical question without a whole philosophical can of worms. Let's now, how do we tackle everything? So these are right, and we can't cover it, unfortunately, all in one session. But the reason I'm bringing this, and this is, I know we're late in getting to like my whole point for why we're bringing it, but I think wisdom is synonymous with an openness, and that's why I started with what my grandpa said about knowledge is what you know, and wisdom is knowing how much you don't know. Right, the fact that God didn't just do this all God's self, right? That God created wisdom or Torah beforehand as a confidant, as a force or something to create it with. We're not talking about any kind of polytheism or like God creating with the help of some other deity or anything. No, it's all from God. But the fact that God has the openness, that even God consults Torah before creating the world. And so I think there's a kernel there to say that the world, creation, can only take effect when there is an openness, right? That when you're closed off, there is no room for creation. There's no room for growth, literal or personal or otherwise. But when you have an openness to say, I need to consult Torah, or I need to consult somebody else, or when there's an openness to learning, even God demonstrates that openness, then there is room for creation and growth.
But in the process of creation, as each thing is created, God assesses and said, it is good.
Right.
Whereas there's nothing about evil.
Right. God doesn't say anything is evil, only when making people very good. But that's because the tree of knowledge of good and evil hadn't been eaten, consumed yet. So God saw that it was good. But right, God is referring to a world that contains the tree of knowledge and still calls it good. So that's interesting. But I want to say one more point about this, which is there's a Kabbalistic concept of tzimtzum, which means withdrawal. That the question is, how could God create, there's another philosophy question the rabbi struggled with, right? How could the God create something finite, like the universe, although modern understanding of the universe is that it actually is ever expanding and infinite, but in the rabbi's conception of something that is a physical world that has a limit, a beginning and an end, right? To its boundaries, at least. How could God, who is infinite, create something that is finite, is a question and the way that they answer that is the Kabbalistic mystical understanding concept of tzimtzum, which is that God actually withdrew God's self, in God's infinite self, in order to create room for something finite, or let's say human beings, right? Life, human life, animal life, the things are finite. God had to withdraw God's self. But that to me, again, speaks to this openness.
No, it's like a parent. In other words, God is the parent, and he's letting go to let the kids, his offspring,
yes,
blossom.
Yeah, and I'll say Tristan is joining us. Tristan is about to start university, right? And there is a leaving home and leaving and that is a painful, right, withdrawing, or a very exciting one. But yeah, right. But that leaves room for growth, right? You can't necessarily, if you stay within that womb of your childhood home, you don't have the room to grow your roots and really become. So there is this withdrawing and God being a parent here that needs to happen in order to create room for creation. And I want to apply that to ourselves, right? When the difference between knowledge and wisdom doesn't exist in somebody who says, I know all there is to know, or I don't need to learn for somebody, or I don't need to be open to what I can learn from others because I know how it is. Right? That maybe that person might have a lot of knowledge that's informing that self-confidence, but not a lot of wisdom, because without openness, there's no growth, there's no creation. Go ahead.
So why did he limit us of not eating from the Etz Hadat?
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Right. Why did God create us in the first place? I love the idea that God was lonely and wanted, right? But then God clearly didn't want us to eat from it. But why does it exist if God didn't want us to eat it, right? But there are cookies in a cookie jar that exist, but we're not supposed, our parents say don't eat it, or maybe you can have one. But God says you can eat all the fruit, but not that one. Maybe it was a test. I think there's a lot of different ways to ask why did God do it, but then the question of God presumably could have had angels or other sort of beings that obey God's will. But when God created human beings, the idea probably is that God wanted more of a human experiment. Like, what if I create something that can define me and choose me? Like going back to free will, because if we're just angels, if we're just doing God's will blindly, does that really fulfill that need God might have for somebody to choose partnership with God? Right, so maybe you need that choice, and maybe that's why it exists. But a good question. And then one last comment, and then I want to make sure we get to the last one.
There's free will because right in the story, man had the free will to decide if he was going to eat the apple.
Right.
No, right away we know there's free will.
Right, and I think that's what makes it interesting. That was what makes this an interesting project, right? Different from, say, angels or what God could have had. Just, a world that follows God's will blindly, but to actually choose.
He had the free will to eat from the tree or not, but he didn't have the knowledge to know whether he should.
Right, because he didn't have the knowledge yet. Yeah, good. Okay, so I want to now go to Pirkei Avot. One last little rabbinic discussion of what it means to be wise. And then we'll round out with a Yehuda Amichai poem about openness. But okay, who wants to read from Pirkei Avot? Please, Sherry, thank you.
There are 7 characteristics in a clod, and 7 in a wise person.
Good, real quick, clod. Why the word clod? The idea is like a blacksmith who is welding metal. The clod is sort of the metal that's not yet formed. So it's got all that potential to be wise, but it hasn't been fully formed yet. I think that's the intention behind that word choice. Okay, go ahead.
A wise person does not speak before one who is greater than them in wisdom, and does not break into their fellow's speech, and is not hasty to answer. A wise person asks what is relevant and answers to the point, and speaks of the first point first and of the last point last. And concerning that which they have not heard, they say, I have not heard, and they acknowledge the truth. And the reverse of these are characteristic in a clod.
Do we agree? What are we responding to? Is there anything missing from the list? You disagree? This is what our rabbinic tradition is painting in the Mishnah of the 7 attributes of one who is truly wise. And also, where do these apply? What are they imagining? Is it just sort of like people on the street that you might run into, or what is sort of the environment that they are probably envisioning where these traits are helpful or useful?
Yes. In all of our rabbinic discussion, there is discussion between rabbis, some of which have greater wisdom than the other. Yeah. So it's not true. I mean,
well, but I think
men can discuss with a man or woman with greater wisdom.
Yes, you can discuss, and you should learn from them. But the point is not to speak before. So, for instance, like when you asked that question about Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat, and what's the difference, and Rabbi Hal was in the room, I addressed it first, mistakenly so, because I should have yielded to one of superior learning and knowledge, right, in the room. That's insulting for me to take it, but I also didn't want to just put him on the spot. Like, that's why I did it anyway. I did anyway, yeah. But that
he responded, he didn't know.
So he's a very wise person, right? But also, actually, what's interesting here, I read it that way too, that it means to have the wisdom to say, I don't know, that there actually is, right? You say, I don't want to lose face, and it's not strong to admit that I don't know something, but actually it does take a even greater strength and wisdom to say that I don't know. That's how I read it originally. I think in this context, it actually means I haven't heard it, meaning my reason tells me this. I actually do have an answer to the question. My reason tells me, but I can't cite our tradition and give you a verse from somebody from the because that's how they debate, right? That you bring there's reason, svara, but then there's citing a source. And so they're saying if you don't have a proof text, to say I don't have a proof text, I haven't heard it, right? Because this is an oral tradition. Yes, exactly, right? But so this is, I think, traits that help you in a Beit Midrash, in a house of learning, right? Which is an oral tradition. So it's to say somebody who does not speak before one who is greater than them in wisdom, right? Let the person who knows say, and does not break into their fellow's speech, right? Because if it's an oral tradition, don't interrupt my train of thought, because if you jump in, I might get to what you're going to ask. So wait patiently until I finish speaking so I can actually say my full point. Not hasty to answer. A wise person, because think before you say, right? A person asks what is relevant and answers to the point, because that's the organization of your thoughts, right? I know if you read Talmud, it's very associative. somehow we go from here to here to here to here to there, X, Y, B, right? It doesn't seem like, but it's all within categories, right? It's all in the same tractate and Masechta. Like there still is an overarching topic that organizes the thoughts. Speaks, okay, first point for it, right? Attack it methodically. And then we touched on the last one, and they acknowledge the truth. So that goes back to what Chad was saying about, and this time it's emet, modeh al ha'emet, truth. And the reverse of a clod, who's not right. So these are what our tradition outlines as characteristics of a wise person, particularly things that you can use to the advantage of the Beit Midrash, of the learning process. But I just want to end again with that idea of openness and how it factors into our conversation about growth happening with openness. There's also a great existential thinker, Simone de Beauvoir, who says that you have to be an absence in order to be a presence. And by that, she was meaning, imagine a cup, right? And if the cup is full, nothing can go into the cup, right? But if you actually withdraw the water, again, this idea of tzimtzum, if you withdraw, then there is room for receiving. And even God does that, right? Our tradition, God models. You would think God doesn't need to do that. But even God, so if God does it, if God withdraws God's help, if God consults wisdom, right? If God looks into the Torah as a blueprint, what's stopping us from acknowledging when, that we might not know everything, or that we need help, or that we wise enough to know what we don't know? So I just want to end with this Yehuda Amichai poem, born 1924 in Germany to 2000, Israel's poet laureate, one of Israel's greatest poets. This is called it's called The Place Where We Are Right. Hamakom Shebo Anu Tzadikim. Does anybody want to read it? Great.
The Place Where We Are Right by Yehuda Amichai. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard, but doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole. The whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood.
And what do we think he's referring to by the ruined house? The temple, right? And what did the rabbis say the temple, what was the reason they give for the temple being destroyed? Not baseless hatred, right? Which I think is an offshoot of this closedness, right? This inability to learn from others, right? What is one of the main issues that we're having today, right? In America, but in Israel as well. And we've talked about this a lot, about this inability to talk to one another, right? Where we get so polarized and solidified, and this is what is right? It is so hard for people of different political persuasions to engage in civil discourse because we're so closed off to the possibility that the other person has anything to add to our own knowledge. And from that place, and that leads to baseless hatred, right? We hate each other, right? It leads to such vitriol and hatred. And from that place, I think is saying that's what the temple was destroyed, right? We cannot, that nothing grows in that place of, right, in that place of closed-mindedness, closed-heartedness, right? Be not lev, as you started our conversation with King Solomon, right? Give me an understanding heart, a heart that is open, right? God says, circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Interesting use, right, of that, and kind of, but what is a foreskin, right? It's this protective layer. And so maybe there's this idea that that protective layer around your heart, cut that open so that your heart is open and exposed to the world, so that you feel the pain of the world, that you feel all the sensations of the world, so that you're open. We talked in our Tu B'Shvat Seder where we're eating different kinds of fruits that have a hard outer shell, but a softer inside, or a soft outside and a pit that's hard on the inside, or just fully soft. And the idea there being that, like, what are the ways in which we have this hard external shell that blocks us out from the world, and how can we be more open people? And remember, we did the Midrash about the God whispering in the ruins, like a roar of the lion that is heard as like a God whispering, right? So I think maybe he's even referring to that Midrash that we covered about the rabbi who stops to pray in the ruins, one of our first Midrashim that we covered. But so I love this poem. Actually, Rabbi Alex taught it during high holidays, if you were at the Schechter service for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. But that idea, right? And I want us to take that with us of the difference between wisdom and knowledge, wisdom being what I think is contained in all of these texts that we've studied, but also in this poem. What leads to growth? How can we retain that openness that allows for growth and not that closed-hearted, trample-off place where nothing grows?
You can't listen when you're talking.
Right.
You've got to listen.
2 eyes, 1 mouth.
2 eyes and 1 mouth, right? 2 ears, right?
Yeah.
1 mouth, 2 ears.
I think you also have to be willing.
Right.
You have to have that desire.
But we're built with ears that don't close.
Right, right. A mouth
We would
closed.
have to physically use another part of your body, but the ears by themselves close down.
And I love that, that every week this is a group of open people who carve out time on Thursday afternoon to come and, like God, look into Torah for its wisdom, for its. So I as always want to thank everybody for engaging in this Torah discussion and learning. Thank you as always. And early Shabbat Shalom to everybody.